Hello and welcome everyone to the Game Audio Hour. This is a fortnightly podcast where we discuss all things game audio, from creative ideas to the latest techniques, project experiences to audio secrets. Here is where you'll find in-depth coverage and opinions related to game audio. We have a full crew here today. It's the four of us. I'm Vincent Diamante. Right down there is Michael Gordon Shapiro. How are you doing?
I'm doing swell. I'm contemplating the question of what are we supposed to do when you were giving that introductory spiel? I feel like it's a little artificial to be smiling all the time, like, kind of a fake Rictus Simpsons kind of thing. But if we just keep the stone-faced stare, that doesn't quite feel right either. So I'm open to suggestions from the rest of the crew.
Well, I learned when I was doing group presentations, if you are not the person speaking, you're supposed to be looking directly at the person who is speaking so as to sort of subtly reinforce what that person is saying. So I guess if I'm talking, you should be craning your neck in these directions, maybe like this dude over here. Alex, how are you doing?
Wait, where am I? I think I'm down here, Vince. I'm good. And guess what? I did not purchase any needless compressors or EQ plugins today. So it has been a good day. I do have a problem, but today I have managed to keep it under control. Plugin Alliance, as you know, has been sending around their buy any of our stuff for ridiculously cheap prices vouchers again. And I did not use mine.
Oh, man.
So I'm going to hold on to this successful run of not buying anything, and I'll make it.
That's awesome. I believe in you. That is so great. You have that conviction. You have that strength. That's really awesome. Speaking of conviction and strength, we've got Chase over there. A paradigm, a bastion of conviction and strength. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, Vince, and doing all right. It's Friday. Our first time doing the show on Friday, and I think I like it. I dig it. I really
that is awesome. Yeah, we're doing some slightly different things with the show now. If you've been with us for a while, you know that we've traditionally broadcast on Monday. When we started out, it used to be a Monday night thing, at least if you're in the US. Then we shifted over to Monday in the middle of the day. Now we're trying something a little bit different, hanging out with you guys on Friday, middle of the day if you're in the US, in the evening if you're in Europe, like Alex over there, deep in the middle of the night if for some reason you decide to drop in on us from East Asia. I think it's, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., some ungodly hour over there. But that's all right. Regardless of the time where you are, thank you for dropping in on our little conversation because we have some fun stuff to talk about, spurred on from some questions and conversations that have come up between us and with some of our listeners. So let's go right into our first topic. Starter tools. What constitutes a starter tool? Because there are some very interesting things that are out there in the worlds of music composition, music production, and sound design that could be labeled or are in fact marketed as starter tools. And I have some very strong opinions on some of these things. Probably the first one is, they really know how to extract money out of us on all sorts of different strata, ranging from students and amateurs to professionals. But even beyond that, there are just a huge variety of tools that are out there for people that are in this industry and people who are getting started into the profession of sound design and music production. I think it might be interesting to talk about how we personally have approached starter tools and what we actually used when we were starting out in this whole profession. I'm going to go ahead and start off by saying that when I was starting off as a college student, I had this very ambiguous idea of what starter tools were, because it was a really different era in the 90s and in the early 2000s. A lot of stuff was happening in hardware, and because of that, there was only so low that they can go. Certainly, you had things like those, I don't know, the Alesis 3630, for example, that sort of entry compressor. Um, the Something like an Alesis nanoverb. Uh, those those little half rack synths from Roland, like that JV1010. It's like, okay, I have to. Okay, I gotta get at least that. This is going to be this basic tool that I will use for sound design, for music production, and I've got to get that thing. And once I get that, I guess I'm going to use the crap out of it. And that's essentially what I did with those things. $50 special mic from Guitar Center, that little Roland JV1010. What about you guys? Like, not to really date us, but Mike, you kind of started out sort of in that same era in the 90s when it came to what is it that I use to start off on this journey.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's been long enough since the start of my career that my describing the starter kit has mostly anecdotal value. I think it just lets us appreciate how much better everything is today. But in that spirit, I think there were two questions you had to solve. You're going to record them onto. In the first category, assuming you weren't working with live musicians, which we thankfully still have today, I think I was also vested in the Roland camp. I had a JV1080, which was one of the hardware boxes that basically played the same kind of low-grade sampled sounds that most of the Roland Romplers did. What was interesting about this is that it had a little, like a roof latch that you could unscrew, and you could slide in up to 4 expansion cards, I believe. So these were like the hardware equivalent of getting a new sound library. And I remember I had the Roland Orchestral Library expansions. Eventually, I moved on to the infamous what are those legit samplers? I'm blanking out on the name. The Roland samplers that were like the half-height racks that had 16 megabytes, not gigabytes of RAM. What am I talking about, Vince? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They had a mouse expansion and a card you could use to route the display out to a CRT monitor. I used that for a long time and I can't remember. But in any case, there were a lot of Roland things in my life because that was a cost-effective way to get a bunch of sounds and what passed for orchestral sounds in those days. For the second question of what are you going to record things onto, I was actually I had a stereo DAT recorder, and that was it for me. I was doing all my mixing on the fly, so no matter how many sampler boxes I had, I was sort of mixing them in real time. There was no DAW. That's an overstatement. I didn't have a DAW that involved audio at first. The audio-equipped DAWs came out later, so you just have to imagine using your DAW just for MIDI, driving outboard. It's so primitive, I almost don't want to tell you unless this was some sort of like cautionary tale of like if you time travel and get stuck in the 90s as a composer, how bad your life is going to be in so many ways. But that was kind of it. So if you had a lot of money, you could buy like an 8-track digital multi-track. And in my case, I just had stereo, and that's how I did my earliest projects. It's so much better today in just about every respect.
Yeah, that's true. That it is a whole lot better today. It really is great. But I kind of want to talk a little bit more about that progression. But first, I want to hear what you guys. Let's keep on going down the line. Chase, what were your starter tools when you were starting off doing sound and music?
When I was starting out, the tools that I was using was Fruity Loops. And before I was using Fruity Loops in 2001, I was using Hammerfall, which was just a rhythm sequencer, similar to like what the Roland is. And then I realized that I could use Fruity Loops because a producer that I really liked at the time was using, things like that. Now in this era, this is like the MPC 2500 is the top thing to kind of get, and different synth keyboards and all that cool stuff. And then I expanded within playing around with PlayStation Music Generator, and then was experimenting with those type of things. But then I stuck forward with, using the DAW Fruity Loops, going from there. And then my interest expanded into music library samples. So Sony Music Loops and sample libraries, or is now Creative Suite. They would have certain packs, and then Big Fish Audio. And then I realized I can pull certain things into that. Then I was gifted a Yamaha RX-5 drum machine that I didn't know about. And then I also, for starting out, because I was I was a teenager, but then moving into early 20s, I realized that the samples were given in really expensive magazines, at least for me, $22 magazines like Computer Music Magazine or Music Tech, and then importing some of those samples to make bigger, better pieces of music and so on and so forth. And then discovering about Craigslist finds, whereas in people would sell their old gear to kind of, sell off, and then acquiring, some things maybe if you couldn't afford that, nice Roland drum machine that was like $300 or something, then you can, get it for a little bit cheaper in that regard, and then pulling some things in that way. And I have to say, mostly though, my resources came from just KVR, digging through Newgrounds. There's always been updates to resources of where to go and things to use, but I definitely grew up with a VST and MIDI controller era, even though I was playing an instrument. But I didn't really get into a bigger world of it all until I went to the Los Angeles Recording School in 2006. And then that's when I really learned about more things to kind of accentuate the sound a little bit further.
Wow, that is cool. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up some of those other resources. I totally forgot about those magazines. I used to go and grab them whenever I could over at Borders or the Barnes and Noble and whatnot. Just like, okay, there's going to be a cool CD here, cool DVD. What's on it? It was just so exciting to try out those, demo instruments and all that stuff. And yeah, Craigslist. There's so much stuff on there. Alex, what about you? What did you start off with when you were getting into sound and music?
Actually, the reason that my connection dropped just now is because I was just traveling back in time to check myself 30 years ago, whenever it was, because I'd actually forgotten. It's quite a long time ago. The very first game that I did audio for was on the Commodore Amiga, and I used ProTracker 2.3B for everything. And funnily enough, my workflow and the equipment that I use hasn't actually really changed that much since those days. I don't use ProTracker anymore. I use Renoise now, which is kind of the modern sort of the bleeding edge of tracker, if that could be such a thing for an archaic 90s paradigm like Tracker. But the first serious console game project that I did was a Sony game, and actually this is the Sony M10, and we had 10 voice characters with about 100 lines each, so a lot of voice lines all recorded with this, and Reaper for editing, and Renoise for music, and the rest was freesound.org, as well as recording my own sound effects, and also a few sort of some of the cheap kind of libraries on soundeffects.com. So not actually that much different from today, really. Although I do have like several thousand needless compressor plugins that I spend several days pondering which is going to give me that warm analog tone each time I break out a project. But no, basically not that different from when I first started, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. You actually reminded me of something that I neglected to mention in my own history, which I think is Well, I'm going to mention it right now. I say that I started off with things like that Roland JV1010, but that's not entirely true because my first forays into computer music were on mods. I had a PC. I didn't have a Commodore Amiga, but I did have a PC and I had a Sound Blaster, which means I could run Scream Tracker. And I learned how to do music tracking with Scream Tracker 3. Oh, come on. It's like, oh, my friend had an Amiga, and that was really cool. I didn't have an Amiga, but, at least I could get into these mods. Those were really cool. I went from Scream Tracker to Impulse Tracker, and it's actually kind of funny that I didn't really think about that as part of that progression, though, in terms of my training in the field of making music with a computer for the creation of digital assets for some sort of game, for some sort of computer executable deliverable. There's not really that much difference from the demos that existed in the computer amateur hobbyist world and indie video games that we have now that really aren't very different from the shareware and freeware of back in the 90s. And yet, for some reason, I actually didn't think about that as my start into music production.
It's all right, Vince. I still love you.
Ha!
I forgive you. Why don't we roll on to talk about what kind of tools could be useful for people looking to get into sound design for games today? Because I feel that's probably a bit more relevant to most people than us old fogies talking about how amazing the Amiga was and how crappy the Sound Blaster is.
Yeah, I mean that's cool. I actually wanted to point that out because I feel like there is a difference there. It's like, oh, I did this music tracking and now I'm doing this real stuff. And I kind of wonder if when we're thinking about the tools that we're trying to get into, should I consider my starter tools in this way? Okay, I am doing this sort of intro starter type model for making stuff. Is this something that's going to incrementally move into what I do for future production, or is this simply a stopgap? This is a learning space, and then I'm going to do real stuff later.
Yeah, I think my feeling about it is I'm not sure if you guys will agree or disagree, and if you disagree, then please feel free to shout and rage. Is that ultimately what matters? If you're not working with other people, which let's face it, probably the majority of us in game audio are not working with other people because we tend to be one on most small and medium projects. There tends to be just one of us, and it's only when you get up to larger projects when you start working in a team. And in those contexts, you probably have some kind of budget and somebody's providing software and tools for you, and you don't have a choice. But in the case where you are working solo, I think my feeling is that really it's the result that matters. And so if you're using Audacity and freesound.org and, torrenting the GDC, if you weren't aware, every year GDC does that game sound, what's it called? Chase, the game sound GDC pack or something like that they do every year. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is just fantastically generous. Like all these different AudioWare companies will contribute a sampling of their catalog, and then you can basically for free you can torrent like a 5 gigabyte every year. It's just fantastically generous, and it's a wonderful testimony to the closeness of our community, which I think is great. But yeah, what I was getting at is that I think that if you are producing good music and you are using an iPad, or you're using GarageBand, or you're using Audacity to do your sound, or you're using, it shouldn't really matter if it sounds very good and it fits the game at the end of the day. Well, what do you think? Chase, am I on it? Am I right, or am I totally wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right. If it sounds good, it is good. And as long as it fits with the optimization of the project, which is really most important, that you're delivering the proper assets. You're not delivering MP3 files or things that are not going to be the most helpful towards the project overall. But, quality, always strive to have the best quality that you can. And if your expectations are here and you at least get there, or if you hit there, you're going to be good. At least I think.
Yeah, if it sounds good, it is good. I think is a worthy adage, but I do wonder for people that are starting to get into this space, how much should we think about that space for learning what is in fact good, or even for them just coming to an understanding of what would be good for them? Because I think a lot of people, whether they're 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, and they're thinking, oh, I really want to do this game sound thing or this game music thing, and having an appreciation for what in fact is good in that space is actually part of the challenge. And I think the tools that people get into are actually going to be very instrumental in forming that idea of good. What is it that they're actually aspiring for, and not just, oh, I've got all these sounds here, I guess I'm playing around with them. Is that what I'm doing?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I see your point. I feel that especially if you go into game audio with the attitude that there is such a thing as the good stuff, the good gear, the pro gear, and there is such a thing as the amateur gear or the gear for beginners and the gear for people starting out. If you start off with that approach, the danger is that you fall into the marketing traps very, very easily, right? The plugin manufacturers will tell you, you've got to use our EQ because it's used by these amazing famous people, and it's all about Pro Tools. And if you want to write serious music for games, you need to be using Reaper or Cubase or whatever. I think that the less time that people are worrying about whether or not their gear is up to scratch and aspiring towards gear that maybe they think is, okay, this is the pro level, is up here. I'm using Reaper, but all the industry people are using Pro Tools. So I should be aspiring to Pro Tools. Like, I think that at that point, it's probably better to just learn your tool absolutely thoroughly, regardless of what it is, because let's face it, pretty much, we're talking about two things. We're talking about sound design and music. It's probably important to divide these apart. But when it comes to music, at least, any one of the DAWs out there, any one of them, like Reason or FL Studio or Hardua or Mixbus or Logic or Cubase or Ableton Live or name your poison, any one of them can work just fine for if you've got a good idea and you could have a good target to go for. I don't know. Like, I see your point, Vince. Though it is important for people to have a like a feeling for that relationship between the kinds of tools that are used by, big industry professionals and the kinds who are not. But I wonder how important that is to be conscious of when you're starting out. That, okay, all the big people are using Pro Tools and I'm not. So I can't be doing stuff that's good enough until I'm using the right gear.
Oh man,
I think from
sorry, I just wanted to quickly say I'm actually not sure if that was my point, but
okay, yes,
because I actually
excellent.
Totally agree with you. And everything is possible. I think maybe we probably have a sort of a different understanding of what I was trying to approach with good, as in other words, what actually constitutes a good standard of the audio itself, and I wasn't really thinking about the gear rather, but maybe that's actually something that I don't need to worry about. Maybe let me think about that for a moment, because I interrupted you, Mike, so you should go for it.
I think Alex touched upon the most important first point. If our topic is starter kits or beginner resources, and that is your DAW, because modern DAWs come with a few exceptions, almost everything you need to get started. It'll vary from DAW to DAW, but I'm most familiar on the Mac side with Logic, which will give you just a decent enough implementation of just about every kind of DSP tool you might want, compressor, reverb, countless synths. It's kind of got everything except strong orchestral sample libraries, which is much more of a specialized field. So in turning to the needs of a beginner, someone who's out of school and is, as Alex said, buffeted by all these sales pitches, just learn what's in your DAW. And here's a good criteria, because there's so much marketing hype behind various specialty tools. Unless you can rationally convince somebody else that you need something, don't buy it. So if you're like, yeah, they emulated every single circuit of this EQ from Germany in the 1950s, and the biggest hit in Sweden was mastered with it. So if you tried saying that aloud to another human being, they would just give you this withering look. And that suggests that you probably don't need whatever it is, unless you're in the mood for an impulse buy. But start with what you've got, and then as you see an opportunity to expand your tool set, then wait for a sale. This is tip number 2. Wait for the sale, because significant sales come around 2 or 3 times a year right now. And then, having thought in advance about what you want, pounce on the lowered price. Which isn't to say there isn't room for kind of impulse buys here or there, but I think that's a good strategy for a beginner.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I want to also just really hop onto Mike's edition of the sales. The way you actually stay abreast of them, my tip is and also tying into what Alex was saying, is I keep a spreadsheet of tools that maybe I've seen other people's use, and I do a little bit of research and I think about it, like, okay, do I need this? I'll put it on there, and it's highlighted, and then I have it calculated to see, like, okay, how much is this going to be? Then with whatever gigs I get, maybe I'll put some money aside, and then with the sale, you sign up for maybe whatever library that you want. And that way, that newsletter comes through, you're notified about it, you reference your Excel sheet, and then you say, oh, okay, well, actually, it's in the budget. I actually just made, X amount of money I can afford this now. This would be great. And then that way you're kind of tied in, and then you step up, to the next level with getting something relatively a good tool for your arsenal that professionals use. And you were up to date in that regard as well. And then I also want to point out that there are really great. What I've seen is libraries putting out pro tips in articles on their website. So places like ADSR Sounds or Bedroom Producer offer a really good amount of resources, and even Native Instruments offers like, hey, we're doing something for free, or check out this article. These are the resources. Here is our community best sample stuff that you can utilize, that you can use in your projects. And they sound pretty good. They're not like maybe that first party Native Instrument stuff, but they're using Native Instrument products to get the quality of standards that other professionals may be already using that you might have not known about. So those are my 3 that I just want to add on into there for starting out.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have a question for Mike and Vince specifically about orchestral libraries, because I think this is a bit of an elephant in the room when it comes to cost. And that is one area where, you can say that it's the music that matters, and the tool's not important. And if you got the good musical idea, then it doesn't matter if you're using, the worst orchestra library that you could possibly find, and it sounds nothing like a real orchestra. But if, for example, you're starting out and your game really, really needs sort of like an orchestral sound, everybody in your team wants to hear like the big war drums and the big brass and the big sort of typical cinematic kind of epic orchestral stuff. And you go to whichever DAW you happen to be using, let's say it's like Logic, and you pull up the stock orchestral stuff that comes with Logic, and you think, oh, this is kind of not great. I can't get that sound. I'm actually trying to achieve a certain sound and I can't do it because these orchestral libraries are just not good enough, and they're not as good as if you fork out the big money for stuff like by Spitfire or some of the major names in orchestral libraries. Do you have any recommendations for what to do in that situation if you have a little to no budget? Your DAW's orchestral sounds are rubbish, but you need to get something that sounds good, and you just cannot afford something like Spitfire or any of the big packages. What should one do in that situation?
I might question the premise that you can't afford anything by Spitfire, etc. Again, just because the sales that crop up several times a year can often make higher end libraries much more accessible. That said, I would divide orchestral composers, roughly speaking, into two camps. And camp one are people who are just getting their feet wet in orchestral writing, and they're typically looking at broad strokes and maybe doing some hybrid stuff where a certain amount of detail fussiness is not going to arise as often. In those cases, a cost-effective way to start might be by looking at some ensemble libraries, libraries like Symphobia or the Albion series that Spitfire makes. And I think Spitfire is just coming out with another round of these ensemble libraries. And these typically map an orchestral family or a combination of instruments to your keyboard. So if you're playing the upper octave of the keyboard, you're hearing violins, and you're playing the lower octave of the keyboard, you're hearing cello and bass, or maybe cello and bass clarinet and contrabassoon and tuba, or some prefab mixture of instruments. And those can help you. They generally sound good no matter what you're doing, and they'll let you do kind of a broad strokes approach to composition, and some of the orchestration decisions are made for you. And those libraries tend to be affordable, especially if you wait for the sales. For orchestral composer type 2, we're looking at people who are a little more trained and want to make more decisions about orchestration, and possibly might want to have multiple options for each instrument type, because the quality and timbre of different flute libraries may suit different types of cues differently. In those cases, it's a harder call. There's really no one universal, cheap and comprehensive solution. You do kind of just need to try things out, try out the demos, listen on YouTube, and take a stab at what seems like a natural next place to expand your palette. Spitfire did the BBC library, which was an attempt to give you a little bit of everything in one package. There may be equivalents from competing library manufacturers. I've not yet heard something that I love in this category, to be quite honest. I feel like the fight between breadth and depth ends up favoring breadth, and you get something that's not as easy to use as those ensemble libraries and does not allow the same element of control as a traditional library. So I would say just start with the string library, because that's going to be the heart of most orchestral writing. Try to look at what's out there. I love the older Spitfire symphonic strings. I think that's a nice mixture of detail and breadth. Start with your strings, get something you can live with, and then expand outwards depending on what you find yourself using palette-wise. That's probably the best I can do on short notice. Vince, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Also, I do want to say that the entry price is really not all that much, especially if you consider some of the subscription models that are out there. You know, if you want to try something like East West, yeah, spending hundreds and hundreds of bucks on a library is one thing, but being able to have access to it for a month for, under $20, that's
$20.
something.
Yep.
That's true.
So yeah, you can definitely do that. I actually, in preparation for this, I kind of spent some time looking at many of these cheaper libraries. Of course, I'm coming at this from your theoretical second type of orchestral composer who's had some training with how to utilize the orchestra and wants to do stuff that is a little bit more advanced than making sure that you have a nice orchestral texture. So I was looking at some of these cheaper libraries, things like Miroslav Philharmonic 2 and the old Sonnenvox orchestra stuff, because when those things are on sale, they are extremely cheap. As in, under $100. Sonnenvox, they actually recently took that off sale because of some significant Windows 10 compatibility issues. But when it was on sale, they would sell for about $10 in instrumental group. So in other words, your strings for $10, your brass for $10, your winds for $10. Very affordable. Not very good. Which is actually really, really frustrating, because the base of both of these libraries was these very extremely expensive productions from the late 90s and early 2000s. Sample libraries that were originally developed for Akai and Roland samplers, things that were back in the 90s and 2000s, the idea of having gigs and gigs of samples for the orchestra was just insane. Something for the upper echelon, your Hans Zimmers of the world. And even though these new libraries draw from that material, I think they actually do a really poor job of utilizing them. Because they are taking that Akai stuff, that stuff that was originally made for those old Akai samplers or S760 samplers and whatnot, and they are not really effectively utilizing them. It's actually really frustrating because I thought, oh, there is going to be some trickle-down effect. We see that in other places in technology where, oh, we were able to have this breakthrough back in the early 2000s. So, of course, we're going to have some reasonable facsimile of that now in our cheap consumer gear. But I actually had the opportunity to acquire the old Miroslav Akai libraries back when I was in college, because people were moving on to Gigasampler, and who needed their old Akai libraries, right? So I could get that, and I was comparing that to Philharmonic 2. It's unfortunately it's just not really great. I think you really do get less than what you pay for with some of these cheaper libraries, and so this is very much a caveat emptor there. There are other places, like I said before, East-West. East-West stuff is generally pretty good. It's usable. People use it in lots of productions all over the world over the course of literally decades now. And that's very affordable. But some of these other things, even if they have a pedigree behind them, that cheap price actually is an indicator that there really wasn't a lot of other effort made into creating this soft synth.
That's cool.
One quick addendum to what you said. It's worth noting that percussion libraries and other short duration samples tend to age better than long duration samples. So I sometimes use percussion samples from the early 2000s from the original Vienna library because they sound pretty much just as good today as they ever did. So that's one area where you can save some money by plundering the works of our forebears.
Oh, those percussion samples are great. I was actually, I wanted to find a good place to put this in, but old Gigasampler G-Town percussion that was made for free. If you search the Internet Archive, you could find them, and you just download them, and it's that anvil in there was a great sounding anvil.
I was going to mention the anvil because, like, normally when you get an anvil sample, you're expecting like this giant, like, hammer of crom coming crashing down and this low register metallic boom. No, it sounds like you took like one of those tiny little reflex hammers that your doctor uses to hit your knee, and you hit it on like a soda can. And the G-Town anvil was the thing you were looking for, especially if you detune it slightly. So yes, that is a treasure. Try to find it if you can.
Yeah, I have to thank both of you for putting me onto that because it definitely helped in one of my orchestral pieces. So thank you again.
We probably should move on to the second topic that we were going to get into today. But just before we do that, I want to ask one quick question, which I believe probably we've covered quite a few times on the show before. But if this show is going to be useful for people who are just starting out, I believe one thing that probably a lot of people are wondering, Chase, maybe you can field this one because this is something you have experience with. Do I need to get a pair of speakers in order to mix a game? Can I do it just with my headphones? Like, is that, what do you think about that? Like, how much do people have to buy a setup with speakers and treatment and stuff like that? Or is you just like your average pair of headphones, is it fine for producing and mixing game audio? What do you think, Chase?
You know, I think this is a great question, and I have to actually say, no, I don't think that you absolutely need them. they're nice to have if you can afford them, and that is great. I saw that Rob Krekel, who's audio director on Last of Us, said that they shipped The Last of Us 2 with the Bear Dynamics, was the newest ones, the 1700s or something like that. So that's saying a lot that they used headphones to ship that type of quality of game. So I have to also say I also shipped some games with my Bears, my was it DT 770 Pros. I've shipped many games with just having these. Yes, I do have some HS ADMs, the originals, but I mean, you have to also think about the player base and what they are gaming on. You know, we're getting more into esports, you know, that's getting bigger, and you know, not everybody's going to have the best stereo setup. We're also talking about new technology engines with VR like Tempest and PS5. They're talking about audio, like modeling after your ear shapes and such, which means you're probably going to have a headset on. So something to stay cognizant about is just having really good, probably a good pair of headphones, and nice to have, you know, good audio monitors, you know, as, you know, a second audio source to reference to.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think that you definitely can go a long way with just a good pair of decent headphones, especially considering that a very large, I don't know the exact statistic, but a very large portion of players will be consuming your work on headphones. However, I think it's worth my enjoyment of game audio work was tripled when I left headphones and went for a pair of speakers, like a good pair of speakers, just simply because headphones are very fatiguing, and you'll find yourself making bad choices just because your ears are tired, because if you had these plastic cups sitting on your head for like 6 or 7 hours, like, oh, everything just sounds rubbish. It's not that it sounds rubbish, it's just that you're tired. Whereas with a good pair of speakers in a nice room, you have so much more stamina, and just that air moving, things just feel so much more vibrant and alive and exciting. And when something sounds good, you feel good, as opposed to where something sounds good on your headphones, it's kind of, yes, it's good, but it, you know, it's good in the same way that like a warm beer is, you know.
Hey, I like Guinness.
it tastes like beer, but it's not like crisp and refreshing, you know.
Oh man.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, let's see. Wow, we've already spent a lot of time on this topic, so let's move on to something else, because this came actually into one of our inboxes. So, and I'm just going to read this question that came in. So this person says, I recently got some advice that in order to really have any shot at a technical sound design position at a studio, I can't have anything online stating that I'm a composer. Is it possible to have a shot at, say, a larger indie studio, like a so-called triple I, if I do both music and technical sound design? That is a really good question. And I do have a gut feeling that says, I'm not so sure about this. Not having anything online saying that you're a composer, that also seems at odds with my understanding of having worked with these larger indie companies, these triple Is. That feels a little bit off to me. But even besides that, I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into this. So, let's, Alex, like... Actually, Alex, have you ever had to hire for someone in a technical sound design position, or have you done most of that stuff yourself? Or
No, I have not had the opportunity to hire somebody technical sound design, mainly because, yeah, I tend to do that myself. We've hired sound designers and composers, but not technical sound designers. I have to say, I don't know, that advice seems a little sus.
sus
I think
4 or
that
sus 2?
Sus 2, you know, the really weird one. Just because, like, if I had a choice between somebody, so I do a fair bit of recruiting, and if I had a choice between somebody who's a purist game audio tech designer, I don't touch music at all. You'll find nothing online that says anything about me ever having written a piece of music or done like sound design. I'm purely tech and programming for audio application, versus that same person who can also say, oh yeah, and I scored this game and I did the sound effects on that game. And here's my portfolio, just in case you're interested to hear what kind of music I make. I'm definitely choosing that person. So I don't really know what, like, I would be interested to hear the person who gave that advice, that if you want a tech sound job, you should not have anything up there that betrays you as being anything else but that. I would like to talk to that person and ask them, like, what exactly would be the benefit in not having experience with the actual assets that you'll be working with if you are a tech sound designer. So, yeah, that's a little strange to me. What do you think, Chase?
Yeah, I absolutely concur with you, because to me, you're working with all of those avenues, and you should have the experience to understand. You understand the role a little bit better when you do it, right? That's really where we're stemming and coming from. But maybe I'm thinking, why is that person giving that advice for the perspective of like the company and such? Are they afraid that I came up with this term earlier because it happened to me this week? Are they sneak rolling? Are they trying? Are they saying that, well, if you're a composer and you pretend to be a technical audio designer, you're trying to sneak roll yourself into a composing position, and they don't really want that? And so I'm trying to understand now the mentality of said companies that may be saying, hey, we're not going to look for any of these people that have composition work on their website, to say of such. So that's something I think is more, as we say, suspect to me overall.
I'm going to venture that there's a grain of truth in this, and it has been distorted as it has been passed from person to person. Like, I think the grain of truth is that if you're looking for a technical position, you do not want to portray yourself as a composer who wants a day job. So you want to put the technical competence first and foremost, and not have Bob Schmeckelfield music, and then at the very bottom, like a few, technical credits. So I think that element might be true, but it sounds like it was perhaps ballooned and overstated and distorted into an extreme that doesn't reflect the truth of the situation.
I agree.
Vincent, have you worked specifically with tech sound design people before, and do they tend to come to the table with all of that experience?
I have worked with a couple. Actually, I'm currently working with an in-house technical sound designer that has had many years of music composition experience. And actually, it's been fantastic to work with him because he's not just a technical sound designer. He's a technical sound designer that works very well when it comes to dealing with interactive music systems and designing some novel ways of addressing the problems and solutions that we're currently butting our heads against. So having that experience, I think it's fantastic. Now, this is very much at a AAA studio, though. This is a larger indie studio. I wonder if this person that's giving the advice is coming at us from a AAA perspective, where, hey, we want to make sure that we know what's coming into our pipeline when it comes to our personnel, who is going to become what, and what's going to be the overall arc, the progression of our sound design team. And we're a little bit worried, perhaps, if things confound our expectation for how the sound design team grows. Maybe that's the issue there. But if we're thinking AAA, having that breadth of experience, I think, is great. Assuming that they are, of course, a proper technical sound design person. Oh, you've got FMOD and WISE chops. You know a little bit about how this design works out when it comes to dealing with Unity and Unreal. I think that's fantastic.
Totally agree. I think because I've had the privilege of working with, I think, probably about 4 or 5 external sound designers or composers, and every one of them has collaborated with us with a full gamut of experience, implementation, sound design, and music. And it just makes everything so much easier. you don't have to explain anything. They get it because they've done it themselves. So, regardless of which of these three areas that you wish to specialize in, I think being able to come to the table with a broad range of experience in all of them is always going to serve to your advantage. I just can't really think of a situation, unless, as you said, unless it's weirdly political, in which case maybe you don't want to work for that company. It may be very stressful for you, and I don't mean artistic stress, unless it's that kind of thing. Like, I can't really think of a scenario where it would be beneficial to actually not have a broad range of experience.
Ooh. Speaking of experiences, what have you guys experienced lately? Or to put it another way, what have you played lately? What have we played? What games are we playing? What music are we listening to? What TV shows are we watching? Let's make sure that we have a lot of time left, because in previous episodes, we've always left this right to the very end after Game Audio Hour has actually consumed its allotted hour. So let's actually have some time to dwell on this topic for a bit. Chase, what have you been playing?
Wait, Vince. We have to cover what this part of the show is called.
Wait a minute.
I believe that
we need a title, a proper title.
Yeah. I think that you actually, when we were discussing what we should call it, I think that your suggestion was conspicuous consumption, and the general consensus was no, I don't think that's a great name, Vince. And Mike was ready to do battle that no, this is the name, because I think Chase used to call it "What Are We Playing?"
Yeah,
which makes sense.
Okay,
I think we should call
let's
it
say
that.
it. So first of all, I'm going to present both titles. So first is "What Are You Playing?" and second is "Conspicuous Consumption." Well, okay, what do we got? What do we got?
I'm gonna let. I know I was chosen, but I'm gonna pass it around.
We have to start with Mike, really. I mean, if you're gonna end your introduction with conspicuous consumption, I think we have to start with Mike.
This week, I conspicuously consumed, assuming anyone was sneaking and looking in my living room through a window. I finished watching season 5 of The Expanse, and I feel like the creators of the show just x-rayed my brain and took out knowledge of what I want in a TV show, specifically a science fiction TV show, and that is excellent plot, excellent characters, and spaceships shooting each other. And I feel like sci-fi has really dropped the ball on the third of these elements. What's great about that show is it's more grounded in believable science than most science fiction. You feel like the authors actually understand something about ballistics and space travel, and they bring in enough of that information to make the world feel believable, but not so much that you find yourself falling asleep because it's too technical. The music of that show is really interesting, and I'm embarrassed that I do not remember the composer's name, but I think it's a very good example of using, I will say, synthetic equivalents of orchestral textures in a science fiction context. So you don't have, it doesn't sound like sampled strings trying to be strings and not being convincing. It sounds like string-like synths taking on the role of traditional string textures in a way that really feels organic to the universe. The music, sometimes it's very ambient. It's nothing you're going to go home humming, but if you pay some attention to it, it's a really good example of that kind of scoring, and I recommend it, in addition to the show being amazing, I recommend it just from a score study perspective.
It sounds a bit like Wendy Carlos.
Yes, but the state-of-the-art of technology allows the sounds to blend a little more elegantly than the analog synths that Wendy Carlos was using. You know, there's a real sense of it's not just the mixing. I think it's the palette of the instruments just blends perfectly with the sonic totality of the show.
Nice.
Very cool. Let's go in clockwise order. So, Alex, what have you been playing? Or conspicuously consuming? How do you want to do this?
I'm afraid, Vince, that I have actually been conspicuously consuming this week, not playing. The KLF, Yes,
Okay.
the KLF.
90s.
And there's a reason for that. It's because a few weeks ago, the KLF suddenly sort of reappeared, and all of their classic music videos, like 3 a.m. Eternal and what's it called, Train to Transcendental, and What Time Is Love. Those classic videos, they all appeared on YouTube, uploaded in very, very good HD quality, and wow, that's, come on, so fresh, so fresh. Like, you could release that today and people say, man, this is kicking. What is it? It's like 1990s classic punk techno, pop techno, I guess you could probably punk pop techno, I don't know. Anyway, it's just so good. And much like a lot of the electronic, like the really classic electronica from that era, when you just take a pause and you remind yourself the actual equipment that they were using to do that on, like 2 or 3 Akai S900 samplers, a D50, maybe a DX7, an analog mixer, and like an Atari running, Notator or Cubase or something like that. And then it just sort of you just sort of realize, wow, like, if you were tasked with making something like that today, with all of our amazing equipment and unlimited potential and all of the stuff that we can do with our gear, it would be extremely hard to top something that sounds like the KLF. So, yeah, the White Room, if you don't know who the KLF is, you should go listen to the White Room immediately, because it is excellent, excellent classic reference for the early days of electronica and techno.
Mm-hmm.
Conspicuous, as you have seen. I have been conspicuously consuming. That one definitely is a case of conspicuous consumption.
Excellent, excellent. I have very fond memories of that. Although I gotta admit, like, I got into it a little bit late when I was seeing what the guys in the mod scene were making reference to. It's like, oh, sampling this and trying to model that. And like, for a long time when I was a kid, I was like, wait a minute, KLF? Do you mean KFMF? Because I thought about that mod, that the music tracker group, KFMF. Yeah. And then I would think of that, oh no, KLF. Okay, gotcha. So that's how my route there. I realized I went out of order, but I'll go ahead and say that I have been somewhat inconspicuously consuming the Triangle Story game demo that recently dropped on the Nintendo shop for the Nintendo Switch. And that is a very nice sounding demo. It's a very nicely made strategy game, or at least a demo of an upcoming strategy game that has some very nice music. For a demo, it's got a great soundtrack already with, some really wonderful, well-produced tracks, some very cool sounds, some very cool voice. And it really scratches that grid turn-based strategy game itch that I just like scratching every now and then, ever since those heady days of Ogre Battle and Final Fantasy Tactics back in the 90s. So this was a very fun thing to try out. It's free. It's a not so quick download because it is pretty large. So make sure you got some space on that memory card on the Nintendo Switch. I encourage you guys to all check it out if you've got a Switch. How about you, Chase?
Yes. Well, I've been consuming too much.
Oh, no.
I've been absorbing. That's why I passed it. Actually, I'm in a podcast learning phase of such, because I'm doing a lot of research for a couple things that of milestones that I want to accomplish within the next couple of years. So aside from podcasts and shows from there, I recently played the game I shipped on console, but just to see how it felt. But that's it. That's not too much. The podcasts are a myriad between game design experiences, stories from other people in the industry, and a mixture of my father's smooth jazz podcast and my mom's real talk podcasts. and a couple others. But yeah, it's been consuming a lot of books. I have to be honest. I've been reading a lot, and so therefore, it's not necessarily playing. I read what I'm learning, and then play a lot on the piano, and that's what I'm experimenting with. It's just some new things overall.
Mhm.
Chase, so wholesome, so wholesome.
Thank you.
All right. This was cool. This was exactly an hour. Wow. So, I guess we need to wrap up our show. To all you guys out there watching and listening on YouTube and Twitch, thank you for checking out the show today. Of course, you could subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Twitch. Besides that, you could follow us on Twitter, where we will tweet out information on when the next episodes of the show are coming out. We're going to keep on going on this schedule, so anticipate 2 weeks from now, Friday, for our next show. If anything changes, you'll see the information there. And until that time comes, we bid you adieu. Later.